Namaste and welcome back to the Bharat Varta podcast. Our guest today is perhaps the most requested person to appear on Bharat Varta. Anand Ranganathan is a professor, scientist, author, and also one of the most popular television commentators in recent times. Uh, his 30-second zingers on national TV have gone viral, and I'm sure most of you would have seen one or two of them. He's also a person who is as articulate as he is forthright in his views. So, without further ado, welcome Anand. Great to have you on the podcast.
Thanks very much, Roshan, and it's a real pleasure and honor. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yep. Right. So, Anand, I have to ask, what is it like being on television with Navika or Arnab and 8 other panelists? We see a lot of high decibel, high energy stuff. I mean, it looks daunting for a layperson, but what does it feel like?
No, well, it's joyful actually. I can find one word for it, and it's a big relief because I come home, from the lab, so it's around 6 o'clock, and then I'm looking to shut off from science, and this is a very viable and very energetic option, and so it's like leading two lives, and I think it's enjoyable because you don't get frustrated in either one of those. If you're leading two lives, you can switch off and switch on. So it's great fun, to be honest. Yeah.
Right. So,
and I must also say that it is also a responsibility because if people call me for for my views, then I must be absolutely straightforward and say what is in my heart because that is not my primary job. So I don't hold back, and of course I'm as polite as I can under the circumstances. But if someone gives it to me, and I give it back. But I've learned to kind of ignore a lot of panelists getting back at me as well. Not completely though, but and I've made some very good quote unquote friends. I think Ashutosh is one, so I don't really mind whatever he says. Tehseen is another, and so many. So people across the political spectrum. I think it is a responsibility because people want to hear views that might not be completely aligned to what they are thinking, what their views are.
Mm-hmm.
So I must emphasize that I don't come to these shows to it's great fun in that sense. If people accept what I have to say, I think that's great. And if they don't, then they are within their rights to abuse me, and I can I'm all right with that. Yeah.
Right. So you have a very different background, right? I mean, you're a scientist, you're an author, you write fiction books. How did you get involved in political debate? I mean, were you always inclined to this in your student years and so on, or was it something of a recent phenomena? How did you get involved in this?
Yeah, actually, not at all, because being from the science background, one hardly gets time to even think about politics, leave alone join it. So all through the student days, of course, I primarily studied in India in a college, did not take part in the university elections. So I think that was helpful. And then when I went abroad, of course, I did not show any interest in politics or elections there and all that. And when I came back, set up my lab for the first 10 years, I didn't as well. But then I think it just came out as a flash that I started writing something. And I think I probably must have thought that, look, this is a good avenue to kind of vent things out, after a hard day's work. And one thing led to another, and I wrote a book, and then another book. And then I started writing articles on politics, satire, science, and everything. And that lasted for around 6-7 years. And I think that gave me an opportunity to know more about politics, about ideologies, about things, what people were saying, to kind of rebut them and think of an argument and a counter argument. So I think, it's been my exposure to, being on public, like writing and on television, has been now for about 9 years now. So I think it's pretty enjoyable. It's good fun because it's not my primary job. So I really enjoy it.
Right. Yeah, I'm curious how this has changed your life. I mean, does it affect, are you able to make better scientific arguments as a result of, some of the jousting that you get used to on television and so on?
No, science is a very reclusive thing. It's possibly the other way around. I dare say if I'm able to make decent political arguments, it is because I always think from the prism of science, always,
Right.
and so it's not left or right or any wing. It's always whether I am or whether you are or someone is social Darwinian or not. So I think a lot of stuff I try and bring scientific arguments, logic into politics, and it has surprised me as well to some extent as to how easily one can do that,
Mhm.
and that is quite encouraging. And I think if only other people were to think along those lines, I think a lot of problems could be solved because. And I've said this before. It's not about right wing or left wing. It is about whether you are social Darwinian or not. That is, do you believe that in so-called for the greater good, you are willing to sacrifice the happiness of others for the greater good? And I think that is what uh, in many ways I think that's important. That's a good lesson that science has taught others. So I think I try to imbibe that and just run along. It's fun at the end of the day. It's not it doesn't reflect on the real job that I do. It's very almost ascetic. The lab is far removed from all politics and everything. If I'm allowed to go there, I was prevented, last year,
Yeah.
for a week to enter the lab. But other than that, I'm on the even in the university that I work, I hardly interact with people who are on the other side of the Iron Curtain. So I'm kind of safe in that sense. They are also probably thinking, "Are scientists fetch for me?" So it kind of helps in that way. Yeah.
Right. Uh, yeah, we could talk about that actually. I mean, that was a pretty interesting thing that happened, right? Where you were prevented to enter your lab. And,
Yeah.
you see that campuses, they are active, at least some campuses are extremely active on the, in terms of politics and activism and so on and so forth. Do you think that's a net positive for the country, or how do you view that?
So, thinking about politics, getting into politics is always good for the younger generation. But that was the first time when I could sense that something is not right because
Mm.
right to protest is a fundamental right, but right to protest does not mean right to prevent. And that's the first time that I felt that looks this is not right because you can protest however much you want, wherever you want, but you prevent others from doing their work. And in fact, left to me, all youth wings of political parties should be banned from universities because that is essentially one of the um, outcomes of the so-called Lingdo Committee report, that was set up to find out about student politics in India. And I think it's about 82% or 83% of the students who were surveyed. They said that they were not in favor of having youth wings of political parties cutting across party lines
Mm.
into politics. And if in Maharashtra, for example, the youth wings are banned from colleges for last 20 years. Um, Not many people know this, but it hasn't affected Maharashtra politics. And students are very politically aware there, possibly as politically aware as they are in JNU or in Delhi or any other part of the country. But it does prevent. For example, IITs, they don't have these political elections, youth wings or political parties. So I think going ahead, the students have to realize that you must not prevent people from doing their job, because what that means is you're not very sure about what you want, that you are acting in a dictatorial manner
Mm.
to get what you want, which is exactly what the farmers are doing. And I dare say that they have won because, probably in the heart of hearts, India is ultimately not a democracy, but an anarchy. I mean, what else is the inference you can get from it? If people block roads, if people block labs and institutes and buildings, and they seem to be getting their way.
Right. Yeah, it's also cause because of state capacity and things to that effect, right? I mean, obviously, considering how big we are and how diverse we are, it's yeah, that is a on that note, right? So, what do you make of the status of the political debate in India? I mean, do you think that we have a healthy, argumentative sort of a circumstance? I mean, sort of a nature right now, situation right now, or do you think that there is quote unquote some kind of fascism in the country, and we're not able to talk about a few things and so on?
Oh no, I mean, it's one of the healthiest places to debate politics, India.
Right.
I dare say even America doesn't, because everything there boils down to ultimately to race and white man, black man, and so on and so forth. Here, people seem to be discussing everything threadbare, and I think that's a great thing. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why many people have asked me, why don't you start your own YouTube channel? Well, I think time is a problem, but the other thing is that I'd like my views to be countered, possibly live by panelists who are not very friendly towards me, and in limited time. So it's a challenge. It's always, everything should be taken as a challenge. Otherwise, there's no fun in it. So we are a very robust debating society. Sometimes we get carried away, but that's all right. There's shouting, there's slanging, and all that. There are various types. You can debate putting rationally across your points and then wait to be countered, or you can put across your point and expect to be countered and interrupted and heckled. So they're all sorts. But I would never say that we don't debate things. If at all, we debate them a bit too much, which is again great. Which is it's fantastic. People are so politically aware.
Right.
When we were young, we weren't at all. I dare say there was a touch of innocence when we were leading our lives as students, to be honest. We were possibly sequestered. We weren't, of course, when I was an undergraduate in India, the boiling things were issues were, I think, Mandal Commission. Mandal happened, then Ram Mandir happened, but it's possibly too faded in the memory. But I can certainly remember that we did not pour onto the streets and do dharnas and all that stuff, or go one way or the other, or maybe people from the humanities did. I'm not very sure, but I don't think even they were as politically aware of all the issues, could grasp the nuances as the younger generation of today can. So I think it's fantastic. Yeah.
Right. So do you see that, we are sort of importing some of these tropes from, the Western world in terms of, you could, think of right-left binaries or identity politics and so on and so forth. And if that is the case, I mean, what is the way out of it?
I think to an extent we might, because there are these words that become buzzwords, and then like woke, for example. And there are phrases that are, that come into our lexicon and they stay there. So there is a little bit of aping and mirroring, no doubt about it. But ultimately, I think it boils down to the ideology that you embrace. And of course, ideologies, they might not change at their core, but in order for them to be acceptable to new generation, they kind of, there is a thin veneer always put on them. So, I mean, communism, for example, has been like that, but it's not that, people who are communists today, they were like what Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin were. It's changed a lot.
I don't think, I don't think some of them even realize that they're communist or leftist.
Yeah, exactly. So, right? For example, I mean, one of the greatest examples you can think of in modern times in politics was that Labour came to power in 1997. Tony Blair became the prime minister, and he was so perceptive that he changed his whole political campaign and tack to New Labour. And he openly professed his admiration for Margaret Thatcher, even though coming from a Labour Party, and that would have been blasphemy even 10 years ago, 5 years ago, in the 80s, in the Labour Party. but he did that and he won. And, he was the prime minister for maybe a decade or so. I can't quite remember. I think, yeah, something like that. So these are the things that, to make ideologies palatable to the new generation, attractive. They kind of, there's a kind of a coat of paint, if I can put it. But the shade of the paint always remains red. I think the problem in India is much more drastic and intractable because of our education system. I mean, we just don't know the ills and the truths about, for example, communism, because we're discussing communism. So people still valorize Che Guevara. They still wear Che t-shirts. They still admire Castro. They love Mao. Pol Pot, not so much, because, even the communists in the West don't like Pol Pot. So otherwise, if they didn't know anything about Pol Pot, maybe Indians would be admiring Pol Pot as well. I mean, they admire Ho Chi Minh. There's Ho Chi Minh Marg. I don't know whether it's still there in Kolkata or not. But these are murderous dictators. And, they still, for younger generation to valorize them, to eulogize them, it's not so much their mistake as the mistake of our governments, who are hell-bent upon not telling them the truth. Now, what I'm saying is, we shouldn't prevent people from turning to communism and becoming communists. But if you give students a choice, you tell them the truth, you subscribe the textbooks that are, for example, the Black Book of Communism, or the truth about Stalin and Lenin and Trotsky and so on and so, Mao, who killed 63 million of his own people. And then you let them make a choice. I mean, if they still want to become communists, then it's fine. But, at least they'll be much more informed, and they will be wrecked by their inner torment that, I'm still admiring someone who killed millions of people. Why am I doing it? While at the same time, I call other people fascists and Hitler because Hitler killed 6 million Jews. But here is someone who I'm admiring, whose photographs are on, CPI banners and all that, Mao, who killed 63 million of his own. At least these questions would then come up. But, that's the problem. So I think it gets exacerbated in India much more because the younger generation haven't been provided the truth about all our historical figures, and Indian as well as international. So it's a big problem. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, if you were to poll the average left-leaning person, I mean, they would think of communism as some kind of a benign welfare state at best, right? I mean, split the pie equally and, share and carry on, I would say, right? So, again, that brings us to, ideologies, right? How important is ideology for someone, to subscribe to, sort of ground your views in some sort of a framework, have an understanding of what's come before, and so on and so forth. So if someone is going to be active politically and debate and so on, do you think that it's necessary for them to sort of subscribe to something?
Okay, that's a very interesting question, because I'm not for junking ideologies altogether. But to many people who ask me and attribute ideologies to me, I always say that my ideology is science. And I remember that Three Idiots scene where these three guys gate crash into a wedding, and they're asked, "Bhai, kahan se ho? Kiski taraf se ho?" So they say, "I'm science ki taraf se." Yeah, their plates are full with mountains of rice, and they're holding the plates, and they have science ki taraf se. So I think kisi ki taraf se hona is possibly important, because you need a kind of frame to slot your ideas in. I mean, you can't be, a complete, like a hermit, like a Kavadia, if I can say it, because then you possibly renounce the world. There are a lot of associations that you're constantly drawing from a myriad, a lot of ideologies. So ultimately, I think over the years, you tend to slot yourself and your ideas into particular ideology. So you might think that you're not a communist, but there are at least 5 or 6 ideas that you find all right in this ideology called communism. You might think that you're not a nationalist, you don't want to wave flags, and you don't want to you don't want cinema theater halls to play the national anthem when you're going to watch a horror film. First thing you do is you stand up, or a comic film, for the national anthem. But you might ascribe to a lot of nationalist figures and the nationalism ideology. Or you might say that, look, my ideas are completely devoid of any mirroring of these figures. So my ideology is possibly science or something else. So I think having a frame is important, and even if you don't walk into political life thinking you will acquire a frame, I think it comes after some time. It comes automatically, because at the end of the day, every day you're possibly professing 2 or 3 ideas or your thoughts every day, and they kind of get collected. They kind of, it's like an anthology. So you publish your Twitter book after 5 years, and it's a collection of ideas. A tweet is like it's kind of
a book in waiting.
Verse. Yeah, it's a book. Yeah.
It's I've always found that interesting, right? I mean, even people who profess certain amount of neutrality or bystanderness, so to speak, I mean, if you were to drop their views, I mean, they fall either on one side or the other. I think that's fairly clear, right? You mentioned
so many. Sorry.
No, go ahead,
you
please.
talked about you talked about neutrality. So I'm never for being neutral, and I've said this before, because to be neutral is actually to take sides. Which is what Switzerland did, because when Switzerland was neutral during the World War, in effect they took the side of Hitler. And as we know, that so much of wealth and all those trophies and paintings and jewels that were looted by the Nazis, from the Jews, they landed up in Switzerland. So I aim to be objective, but never neutral. Never abstain from any arguments, because that's kind of cowardly is too harsh a word, I suppose. But I think it's kind of going towards that.
Right. Yeah. Have an opinion, basically.
Have an opinion. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, you mentioned history briefly, and I want to talk about that specifically, because I think most of what we're talking about, any topical issue, it comes down to, again, a grounding in history, right? Figuring out what's happened before and so on. Now, neither the right nor the left nor the center or anyone can agree on what history that is taught in the schools or whatever, especially in India. Do you think that something will come out of it, or do you think that the answer lies in sort of a decentralized like a social media platform or things to that effect? I mean, people will get this information organically via other sources and maybe not necessarily through school curriculum as such.
Yeah, again, that's a very tough question, Roshan, because I've always felt that this government has been absolutely hopeless in trying to reform our education system. As far as the textbooks are concerned, as far as, the means, they are good at reforming. So the new education policy came. But I've said it's, much more important than, how you teach. Changing how you teach is changing what you teach, because that is what is the take-home thing for the students. And I remember taking the example of True Indology, for example. He's busted so many lives of historians day in and day out. And there's so many other people like that, but he prominently comes to mind, because what he says is just simply astonishing, and you feel like a complete thorough idiot, because you said, this is what I learned at school, and my God, this is not right. So all those figures like, Tipu, Aurangzeb, and all these figures that were lionized in our textbooks, complete frauds, genocidal mass murderers. And then social media and people like True Indology, they kind of, open a path for you, for your own discovery. But while you're doing all this, it's always in the back of your mind that shouldn't somebody have done this and written a book that we subscribe to as school children, so we wouldn't have to do this. And I think it's a grave problem in our country, but this is a problem which is all around the world, because politicians ultimately have biases, huge biases. And those reflect in the kind of things that they want the younger generation to be taught as well. So for example, I remember at the dawn of the millennium, there was a poll in BBC that the BBC conducted, that who's the greatest Briton of all time, and Churchill came out number one. Here are the younger generation of Brits who are choosing a genocidal mass murderer who pioneered chemical attacks, who was racist to the extreme, who is directly responsible for the murder of 4.5 million Bengalis during the Bengal famine, and who took pride in annihilating natives his pride in being not a single native of Tasmania. He's smiling about it, laughing about it. So when they could choose such a man as the greatest Briton, doesn't that also reflect in that they have always eulogized this man? No doubt about it that he won them the war, but tell the truth about the man. But that is what neither the conservatives or the right or the left want to do, because ultimately they're scared. And this is the thing that I've always I tell whoever asks me this question, is that if there is one domain which is totally apolitical, that doesn't care, that always tells you the truth, is the domain of science. That there are many discoveries that fail the test of time, that but at least you put them out in the open and you deliberate on them, and things are peer reviewed, and there are people who for and against it, and if you're wrong, then you accept it and you move on. In science is like that. So if there is one huge domain that can do it, why can't it? I say every history, every sentence in history should be hyperlinked. By that I mean is that every sentence that you write has to be factual. Now you can make an opinion about basing your opinion on facts, but you can't airbrush history. You can't just tell one aspect of a man and hiding the other. It's not your job to do so. It is the job of the person who's reading what you've written to make ultimately an opinion. And it would be an uninformed opinion if he reads just one side of a man. Nehru comes to example. All my life, Chacha Nehru, as we were growing up, then as college students, that thing about that Shankar, the famous cartoonist, who drew Nehru unflatteringly, and Nehru said, "Don't spare me, Shankar." And there is the man who stood up for freedom of speech and expression, and he was wonderful, liberal, and all that. So only now, when we started digging, we find out that he was one of the most autocratic despots in the garb of Democrats, in the democracy that we had. The guy was banning and jailing editors and artists, and banning books and films and all sorts of things, sacking legitimately chosen elected governments, 50, 60 instances. This is the same Nehru. Now, why did, if you're doing it at my age, the mid-40s, something has gone wrong. This information should have been fed to me or known to me when I was in my teens, or when I was at least in my 20s, but it wasn't. So it's the same for every historical figure. So it's a shame.
Yeah. No, that's a very interesting point again, because I think I definitely agree that there's a midpoint between, being entirely objective and dry, and, being hagiographical almost, right? And flattering everything, airbrushing everything. And perhaps, we deserve competing points of view, right? Maybe there are 3 or 4 or 10 versions of something, and maybe, we could see what the mainstream versions of something is. One of the things that comes up often in political debate is the level of polarization, right? I don't know if people were saying this 10 or 15 or 20 years back, but they always say that things have never been as polarized as it is right now. Views are weaponized. People are playing a team sport. One side objects to something, and the other side uses the same thing, objects to something else, and so on. How do you see that playing out?
Per se, I have no objection to polarization. Things can be or should be possibly as polarized as they come, because when things are polarized, there is a kind of energy that goes around. People are energized to discuss it. It's not something which is staid and kind of stoic and boring. Of course, all the countries. I always say this: any country that is not in news is progressing really rapidly. So the Nordic countries. When was the last time you heard something happened in Sweden or Norway, for heaven's sake? So they're quite happy with their lives. So maybe Canada comes to mind, but only India has always been in news, especially for Indians, because things were so polarized. They themselves weren't very sure about their ideology, but they wanted others to embrace their ideology. So that is how, you still have millions of Indians still calling. But as far as polarization is concerned, I think it has become more polarized because of selectivity. That people say that even in this day and age, you have knowledgeable, at least colleges, who've done good schooling, they are so willingly and openly, hiding and being selective. And that can only mean that they are peddling their agenda. Because why would you be selective otherwise? Now, take the example of this freedom of speech and expression. And I talk about this in light of the fact about this Tandav controversy that is going on.
Yeah.
I think the one stand-up comic has been arrested. But of course, thousands of people have been arrested, and hundreds have been arrested in the last 6 years, maybe more. Every week, somebody or the other, maybe 10 or 12 or a dozen people are arrested for offending religious sensibility. So this law, Section 295A, is still there. There are FIRs registered. So it's very deflating that every time you hear a news, either on the day or maybe you have to people expect you to stand up for those people. So maybe I should have a pinned tweet that I'm against FIR, against any stand-up comic, against any film, against any artist, against anyone based on this Section 295A or even worse. But the point of the fact is, these people themselves have ignored so many cases where people, through their Hinduphobia, have been going hammer on tongs only about one religion, and the thing is, they themselves realize that they dare not talk about, let's say, Islam, because if they do, they will be beheaded, like Kamlesh Tiwari was, or they'll be murdered, like the Charlie Hebdo journalists were. They know this, and yet they ignore it, and they keep on denigrating and mocking just one religion because they know that Hindus are per se very tolerant. Nobody's going to behead them and all that. But this goes on and on and on. And ultimately a stage comes when maybe the Hindu says that, look, this is wrong what is happening, because what you're giving is the impression that everything that is wrong in any religion is only in Hinduism is wrong. All the other religions, all the other communities are absolutely fine. They're very progressive. We are the ones who are regressive. And the truth is actually not that, but it is the other way around as well. Because if you look at even institutionalized reforms that have happened only in Hinduism, and Hinduism has allowed it. And when I say institutionally, I mean the Hindu Code Bill, that was passed by Jawaharlal Nehru in the 50s. And Hindus accepted it. Can you believe that if, did Nehru have the courage to pass a Muslim bill? Even now, Shah Bano judgment, we know Congress reversed it. So when people know this, why on earth would you be selective? So that's why that there should be, while I'm totally against persecuting any art, stand-up or filmmaker, documentary maker, I'm totally against an FIR. I've said this, I've stood against such boons, if I can call them, that it is painful. I stood for example, Prashant Bhushan and all his rants. I stood with him when the Supreme Court admonished him and said, held him guilty of contempt. I stood with all these, louds and thugs, essentially. Yeah, sometimes they are thugs metaphorically, sometimes in reality. But I do it because freedom of speech and expression is dear to me. But on the other hand, I take back, and these are not my words that I'm going to say right now. These are words of a man who said it 100 years ago. And he's the guy who, quote unquote, hated Hinduism so much that he changed, his religion. He became a Buddhist. I'm talking of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. And he exposed a lot of ills that are there in Hinduism. And he fought with Gandhi over the meaning of caste and varna and all that. So you can certainly say that he was not a Hinduism lover. But a man like him did not keep quiet when a book appeared, by an author called Mayo, that incidentally Mahatma Gandhi called a gutter inspector's report, and that was scathing towards only Hinduism. And it was up to Ambedkar who stood up and said that, look, this is giving the impression that everything that is wrong in only Hindus and Hindu society and Hinduism. People are left with the impression that the Muslims and Islam are very progressive. And nothing could be further from the truth. Anyone who knows India and has lived in India would realize that. This is what he said. Did he need to say this? But he did. because that's the right thing to do. He was afraid of selectivity, because selectivity, even though it brings us eyeballs and you have these armies along with you who assemble and fight, at the end of the day, you are left the poorer. You're not wiser, because you are peddling an agenda. You're not able to realize that just going after one religion, when there are so many ills, much more or not is of course a relative thing, but there are so many ills of other religions that you're not exposing, and you are giving this wrong impression that everything is all right with them, but things are wrong with us. And this is what Hollywood or Bollywood, Bollywood, sorry, have been doing, and all these leftist people and all these quote unquote urban naxals in their writing, they have been doing, only exposing the ills of Hinduism, sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly, sometimes over the board or whatever. So this, I yesterday, in fact, I tweeted that I'm not for banning them, I'm not for persecuting them, but maybe they should append their creative work with a kind of a statement saying that we know we are doing this, and because Hindus have taken it in their stride, we dare not mock Islam, we dare not mock the Muslims, because we know we would be beheaded. So yes, we are cowards, we are hypocrites, and we know we are doing this. Please accept. And believe it or not, Hindus possibly will, because they would understand that yes, all right, you do it. And there's if somebody comes out and says, look, I'm being very honest with you, I don't have the guts to talk about Islam in the manner in which I've talked about Hinduism. Hindus would accept it and say move on, because it has been a very tolerant system for a very long time. Nobody has been beheaded for like in the film PK, you show the Lord in a toilet or in a very derogatory fashion. In Tandav, you show somebody who's called Shiva and who's having a trishul in his hand, using the F word and so on and so forth. If you append that with that, look, we are cowards, but please allow us to do this. We are hypocrites. We don't have the guts to go after Islam, but let's do this. Many people would accept it. Things would calm down, Right. So this is something that has led to polarization, led to anger. There was this magical tweet by a guy called Revolutionary Monk. It's about 8-year-old tweet, and it is so true, because I think it reflects and it goes to the heart of your question as why do things become more polarized. It is this simmering anger that and he says that I was an atheist, yeah, but the media made me a right winger or a Hindu. And then he says, I was a Hindu, but something else, the discourse, the narrative made me a communal right winger, So this change has come about as a very defensive strategy. It's anger, most of the anger, is actually reflected along, even if you see most of the articles in the non-left publications, they're mostly rebuttals of the complete nonsense that has been peddled against Hindus or against Modi or anyone by all these leftists. So that is what is leading to more polarization, selectivity.
Yeah. I mean, freedom of speech is such a difficult thing to adjudicate, right, or litigate in some sense. I mean, I can't foresee any law that would be, equally applied or whatever. I don't think that is possible. There's always this argument when you talk about freedom of speech that, hey, you can't really shout fire in a crowded theater, right? And I mean, it's well, I mean, it could be way far from that specific instance or whatever it is, but you always default to that, and people say that what, freedom of speech is not absolute. You should have a certain sense of responsibility. There are certain things like morality, order, whatever, right? I mean, you could name half a dozen things that it is subject to. So really the question is, where do you draw the line?
Yeah, and I think I've thought a lot about this, and some of the things I probably don't even remember, because this analogy of shouting fire in the theater, I had a very nice response to that, but maybe I tweeted it. I can't remember the exact response. But when you shout fire in a theater, you do it with the knowledge that you're going to harm many lives. So it is actually literally turning into, as they say, that what is it that your right to punch I can't remember, is not, it's only until it kind
extends,
of, your right extends to, till my nose is not punched or something. So in that case, it is quite literal, because you have the foreknowledge that if I shout fire when there is no fire, I'm going to lead to, a kind of a bhagdar, and people are going to die, or maybe suffocate to death, which is what happens when you do that. So, I mean, then you are certainly culpable. But other than that, I think when you delve into an area of gray, that is, who is to decide? And that is what the tragedy of our country is, because one fine day somebody can get up and say, look, according to me, you have offended the religious or other sensibility, and I'm going to prosecute you. But it is dependent upon you. You are making that decision. There is no hard and fast rule. There can never be that, what offends others, what doesn't. And of course, this law, Section 295A, actually came about through, as you would know, there was this book that was published, Rangila Rasool. Now, that book led to the assassination of the publisher, and people celebrated the assassin, right from Allama Iqbal to Jinnah, who fought for him in the court, to lakhs of people who turned out at his funeral. But in fact, not many people know this, that Mahatma Gandhi was against the publication of that book, but Ambedkar stood for the publication of that book. And that publication of Rangila Rasool was, as a kind of a defense mechanism, was a rebuttal to a Muslim publication that called Goddess Sita as a prostitute. So this was a reaction to that, and there was no law. There was no law to prosecute the publisher. And Gandhi, in fact, after Gandhi kind of ranted against Rangila Rasool and said, "I wish something could be done." This thing, Britishers brought this law. So on one hand, you have Ambedkar who's standing for it. On the other hand, you have Gandhi who's against it. You can't have, you can't just stick to one view. So this kind of delving into the gray, into what constitutes decency, what constitutes morality, these are all gray areas. I'd much rather not have it. Give the freedom to everyone to say what they want to say, because, let me not be the arbiter to decide that this is wrong and this is right. I should never do, because I'll be the first one who would be in the dock when people are saying that, according to me, you are wrong. But on the other hand, you look at also the hypocrisy when you talk about people being offended. You pick up any holy scripture, and you pick up the holy scripture, let us say, of Islam. They kind of, or any religion, for example, Christianity even. I mean, I have tweets that have tweeted straight from Bible, and they're pretty horrific verses. The point I'm making is that we seem to accept the hatred coming out of our religion so gladly, right? In fact, I was caught up in it. I was banned for 10 days by Twitter because I quoted verbatim a verse. It said that we have prepared a humiliating punishment for anybody who abuses Allah and His Messenger. That's a verbatim thing, and Twitter termed it as hate speech. But they had to backtrack, because if they deemed it hate speech, then all the Muslims would have really gone hammer and tongs after Twitter. How dare you call a holy verse as hate speech? But you look at the hypocrisy here. So people are identifying what a man is saying or doing or writing as hate speech. But right within their houses, they have these books that are spewing hate. But at the same time, we are perfectly happy with it. Nobody is banning any religious scripture. I don't want them to, but I'm saying that, look, I'm calling out their hypocrisy. So when we can't even decide what is hate and what isn't hate in our religious scriptures, who are we to decide what another guy is saying is bad or not bad?
Right. So there's also this other nuance of criticism of the government versus criticism of the nation itself, right? I mean, oftentimes you might have heard one side or the other make this argument that, hey, you know what, anti so-and-so is anti-India, right?
Yeah.
And I was wondering, I mean, your thoughts on this, right? So where does it extend to, what is the right way to talk about those things and so on?
No, certainly being anti-government is not being anti-India. Absolutely not. I mean, that's preposterous. But I'll tell you what has happened. People who were anti-Modi 6 years ago, through their hate, they internalized it so much that in many of their statements, first they became anti-Hindu, which again is all right, left to me, that it's fine that there are people who hate other religions. So Hinduism, one aspect of it, the religion aspect of it, you can hate. You're within your rights to hate. But then slowly they themselves have actually turned into anti-India. They now start hating everything that India achieves, everything. So it's a pointer, it's a reflection, not to the person who is accusing someone of being anti-Modi, anti-government, becoming anti-India. The person himself or herself has actually turned into one. And it's a one-way street, because you can't ever come back, because you've compromised, you've shown up yourself, you've exposed yourself as being so hateful that you can't draw a demarcation between anti-Modi, anti-government, and anti-India. And I think it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy because clearly this government over the last 6 years has done thousands of things, has passed hundreds of bills, has acted on thousands of things. Now, clearly you can have disagreements with some of those thousands of things that have been done. Let's say 1,000 things. So you can say 500 of them are absolutely rubbish, I'm against it. Or you can say 700 of them can be rubbish. I find maybe 100 of them to be absolute, wrong, and I've criticized them. But you can't say that all thousands of them are rubbish. If you do that, I mean, that's unreal. That's paranoia, And one classic example was this toilet scheme of Narendra Modi in Swachh Bharat, and you making millions of these toilets. And you have this left-winger saying that, look, this is wrong. Why? You say because, a toilet is preventing the women their bonding time, that in the morning they would go to the fields together and they would have a chat. So, now Modi has made this toilet, and this is terrible. This is fascism, because he's preventing others from, exercising their rights. When you hear things like that, they are so much in the realm of, they say from the sublime to the ridiculous. This is the other way around. This has gone to some territory where you really, it's like Jupiter's escape philosophy. You cannot rationalize it. So, but what to do when some people turn, from anti-Modi into, anti-India? This is a right example of someone turning anti-Modi from being anti-Modi to anti-India.
Right.
When you find people like that,
Yeah, some of the things that are said are so bizarre, actually. I mean, and in fact, I find the best critique of the government often comes from within the government itself, from the same side itself. And,
there's a different,
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, no, I don't think the best critique of the government comes from within the government. I don't think.
I mean to say, from the same, technically from the same side, or same tent, or same broad.
The non-left.
Yeah.
Yes, no doubt about it. It is the non-left that gives you a rational and logical critique. I think primary reason for that is that rationality and logic are things that are missing from the left.
Not a leftist trait.
Yes, they're not. And I think, well, let me correct in a very kind of jocular fashion. What you said is also possibly true, because we have Dr. Swamy. Dr. Swamy has been going hammer and tongs about and he is obviously probably not within the government, but as part of the government, as part of the party. And he's been critical, but off late, I think he's kind of gone to sometimes very, ethereal mannerisms and manners in which to critique. But I think before that, some of his critiques should have been taken seriously. Right now, it's too muddled up. It's it's kind of strange. But certainly, you're right. You see it from yesterday night itself. When you had the agricultural state minister, or maybe he's the cabinet minister, he's saying that there was an ANI tweet where his interview was that we have offered to put in limbo these farm bills for 1.5 years. The amount of criticism that has actually come has come from the non-left. They have blasted this government, because they want good for the country. The people who've been silent are these damn hypocrites. These leftists and all these guys who call themselves liberal, who should think that, an India that has reforms would be a better India. These are the spineless cowards who are actually, silent about what the government is. So I think the government should be, have its eyes and ears open. And the problem with government is that it always addresses the criticism from the idiots, from the left. It never addresses the criticism, genuine criticism that is coming from the non-left. That from the BJP supporters, there are so many who've been absolutely scathing towards the 303 ऐसे ही दिए थे, अगली बार नहीं दूंगा vote. It's complete mayhem on Twitter.
Right.
That's a great thing. That's absolutely great. And I think that's one of the reasons I wrote it in 2016 itself, that the right can never have an ecosystem. Because the right recognizes it is almost Darwinian. It goes for competition of ideas, There is no propping up or hoisting on the shoulders mediocrity like the left does. All these historians and all these opinion makers and mediocre, the chalky fail. I won't wrap my kachoris in the articles that they write in. It's so mediocre. But yet they are tom-tom as, the India's pride and, all that stuff. So the leftists, they excel in this because they've made this ecosystem where they would support mediocrity. In right wing, we fight. Or in non-left, we fight for ideas. And if your idea is good, आग की दरिया से निकल के जाना चाहिए. ये नहीं कि you profess something, and that is why I love Twitter. कि आप कुछ भी बोलो, अगर गाली मिलती है तो अच्छी है. I might block a few and go over the board. But I love this medium because you put your idea, and if people hate it, they critique it, then you take in that as a counter argument. You kind of strengthen and bolster your own argument based on the counter argument. And that is the lesson that Twitter has taught you, that any argument that you put in public, first you must have already thought of a counter argument already. Don't allow for others to think of a counter argument, because that is silly. Then you will appear like a fool. You put out everything, at least 5 counter arguments or 2 or 3 of those of your arguments, the counter devil's advocate, as I call them. You should know it already before you put it out in public, because what that does is it kind of reaffirms not only your belief, it kind of gives the correct impression that you're being logical and rational. You've thought it through. Any idea has been thought through. And that is what non-left does and left doesn't do. So I think it's fantastic, this kind of fight that happens, quote unquote fight.
Right. Yeah, I mean, platforms like Twitter and Facebook and whatever have completely broken down credentialism, right? I mean, one of my favorite moments on Twitter was, I'm forgetting who the celebrity was, but that person was challenged on, not a celebrity, an intellectual, that person was challenged on something she said. And, she retorted saying that, hey, you must have a PhD in some subject, right? And the guy replies saying, as a matter of fact, I do, So yeah, that was hilarious. So, speaking of Twitter and Facebook, big tech has become, a major thing to consider, right, in all of this debate and everything, because I think they've moved far beyond being platforms to actually being publishers at this point of time. And if you look at globally, they are the ones who are arbiters of any kind of a speech and expression right now. And, given your own personal experience on Twitter, what do you make of this?
No, it is downright dangerous. And what is happening is almost Orwellian about it. That the left is behind it is not surprising at all. Because these are the people, you see, why are people scared of a confrontation of ideas? It is because they somehow are not sure about their own ideas. They suffer from this inferiority complex now, which is what I believe if all communists and leftists do, because they have to. They are professing an idea, a thought that they know any nation that imbibed it has been absolutely destroyed, from Soviet Union to Venezuela, right? Dozens of them. Any person who imbibed it has turned out to be a genocidal mass murderer. From Stalin to Mao to Che Guevara, not to that extent, but to Pol Pot. So they know this, and yet they profess it. So they have this kind of an inferiority complex within them, ingrained. And we're not so sure about what we're saying. But outwardly, they're so confident. If there's one thing you have to learn from these guys, is knowing that they are wrong. They have this public image of being so confident. Chala idea fail do yaar. It's like, wow, I'm right. And this is what these guys are doing to now these platforms. But the virtue of being called a platform is simply that all trains should be allowed to come to that platform, right? You can't decide. Otherwise, it's not a platform anymore by definition. And this is what these guys are doing because they're scared. This is mind control, very Orwellian. And I think our government is so silly that it doesn't. The tragedy is that, look, this government also, like all previous governments before it, has been restricting free speech. So it is not sab koi doodh ka dhula nahi hai. If I have a thread of the trampling of freedom of speech under Congress, I have a thread of trampling of FOS under BJP as well. It's not 275 tweets strong. It's 50 or 70 tweets, but everyone is doing it. So the point is, BJP, many right wingers rightly say that they use that meme from Gangs of Wasseypur that has a kind of an abuse. So I'm not going to use that, but they use that meme for the BJP ministers. Ab to jaag ja, Ravi Shankar Prasad and Prakash Javadekar. They call I don't know what names. But they won't wake up because none of the ministers, BJP ministers, or none of the powerful ministers have ever been banned by Twitter, right? None of them are as crazy in their views or professing them as Donald Trump. They're not mad. I mean, that guy was a complete mad guy. So they know that they would never be banned. So it doesn't affect them. What they don't realize that Modi is not setting the narrative. The daily narrative on social media is being set by people who are fighting for ideas, for right-wing ideas, for ideological ideas, left-wing ideas, fighting them. Fighting is not being done by Modi and by Prakash Javadekar and by R.S. Prasad. They are unaffected by it. So they would go to Twitter meetings and they would, these photo ops. I met Jack, all these things. The real guys who are being tortured by this kind of platform becoming, editors, playing God, are the guys who are fighting their ideological battle for the BJP, for the right thing. And these guys are unaware of it. And when you ban someone, for example, so many cases, right? I mean, True Indology comes to mind. The fellow has been banned 5-6 times. It's ridiculous. The first time he was banned was his tweet showed an image of Goddess Durga, unflattering image of Goddess Durga, but he was showing it because that was part of a poster, a communist poster. He tweeted that. They banned him. They banned me, but that was for 10 days. But they banned so many. I mean, they banned Jaggi. He had to remove, his post on Chanakya. What Chanakya said is not what Jaggi said. It was Chanakya said. They banned Ajit Bharti. Okay, he's Op India. This thing. So it's almost as if BJP ki aankhein hi band hai. Matlab, I'm not saying that they should come down hard on Twitter and say, look, we are going to ban you. But the point is, they have to realize that they are not the guys who are at the front line. Javadekar, Ravi Shankar Prasad, ab to jaag jao. Maybe I'm not using the full form of the meme. So, please don't ban me from this podcast. But you know what that meme says. Ab to jaag jao. You are not being affected by Twitter. Twitter is not going to ban you. But Twitter is banning those who are fighting your battle. When will you realize this? Kab jagoge bhai? People like Ajit Bharti have been banned for 3 months. For what? For quoting a fact about Islam. So many. True Indology, every month the fellow is banned. Do you not realize that, people who fight, do you have no conscience? So I think India should come out and say that, look, all your rules that are valid may be valid in America, but your rules for playing God, for editorializing, for saying I'm going to ban this, I'm going to ban that, are not going to be valid if you are going to function in India. Okay, it has to be all. Let me also tell you a rational argument against this, Roshan. That is that many people say the leftist favorite retort is, "Arey bhai, you don't like Twitter, you quit Twitter." And that is such a childish and juvenile argument, which obviously them being leftist, I don't expect anything better. But the point is, if today Twitter had these 200 rules, and I was new to Twitter, I got to know of Twitter today, and I said, "Would you join Twitter with these 300 rules?" I probably wouldn't. The fact is, when I joined Twitter, Twitter had 2 rules. There were none of these things that we will ban you if you, for example, if you draw a metaphor or an analogy between a religion and an animal. Twitter says we would ban you. So you can't call a religion, a vermin or something like that, a rat or something. these idiots don't even realize that, one of the holy books has called every non-believer as an ape, as a vermin, okay, and all derogatory things, as a snake. So what Twitter is in effect saying is that, the holy book should be banned. So these are the idiots that have made these rules. Now, these rules were not there when joined Twitter. Now, it is unfair practice for an organization, okay? It is for public good, but even beyond that, even if it is not for public good, even if it is for making profit, you can't change rules midway, because what happens is you've attracted me, you've captured the audience, and now change the rules.
Yeah, I mean, I think the general point that you were trying to drive is that, the people who can do anything about this are not affected by it. And there are the whole, bunch of people who are invested in building this narrative or fighting ideas, and the whole marketplace of ideas as such. I mean, they are the ones with skin in the game. And to be honest, I mean, I really don't see a way out of this for Twitter and Facebook either. I mean, I think, considering that they've staffed their teams with quote unquote policy people for hundreds at a time, lawyers and so on and so forth, I think they're also expecting some sort of a regulation to show up at and maybe Uganda is leading the way for us.
No, you see, I think the thing is, there is a way out. The way is very simple. I mean, you can have all leftists and die-hard communists with blood on their hands who've taken part in riots being in charge of Twitter. But if the government of India says that, look, it is you are going to operate in India if you have no rules, and anyone, if you simply remain a platform, and any incriminating thing that anybody does using your platform is obviously subject to the government of India, the IPC rules, right? So you are not the arbiter. Let the IPC, let the courts of India judge whether that person needs to be banned or not. This is a simple thing that the government must come and do. So it doesn't matter if it's been run by leftists or communists or Naxals. It doesn't matter, because if they are helpless, if they can't decide, if the only deciding, adjudicating body is the Indian courts and the Indian laws, what can these guys do? They'll be exposed in a minute if they are still banning in spite of the government saying this. But the government won't do it because it doesn't affect them, and it's one of those silly things that politics, it changes you. You're no longer with the you no longer face the ground. And I'm not completely I'm not saying that the thing is completely lopsided, because there are still people youngsters who know the vibes, who can feel the the air around them, like Tejasvi Surya. He's been taking this forward. He's wanting to do things and kind of correct what rubbish Twitter is doing. But other than that, I mean, BJP has thousands of people other than Tejasvi Surya or maybe a few others. Nobody is making a thing. I mean, they held a parliamentary hearing where Jack refused to come. What happened after that? Nothing, Whereas you see all these Jack and they make a beeline and they're scared shit going to Senate House hearings. So we are a weak country in that sense. And that stems from a complex. We're not sure about what we want to do.
Right.
And that's the real tragedy, because so many people would be put under the bus. People like True Indology, people like so many people who all they want to do is to put their, as you said, a marketplace of ideas. So these are the people who want to put their ideas into the marketplace. Let people decide whether they want to buy those ideas or not. And in a way, BJP is hurting them more than hurting the leftists. But so you can't do anything.
Right. So, I want to end on whatever you're optimistic for. Considering that you spend a good amount of time talking about India, debating about India, and all of these things, and there seems to be a couple of different Indias, right? And it's almost a cliche when you talk about it. There's a Bharat and there's an India, and there's a new India, there's an old India. I mean, there are plenty of these things that are called out again and again. And especially in light of the recent cricket match, right? These things have been a lot more magnified, right? I mean, that there's a new resurgent India that's not going to take shit from anyone and is going to, stride forward confidently, right? So as we enter this new decade of 2020s, what are you most optimistic for?
I think I'm optimistic about that the nation, the younger generation, possibly is now has a handle to make the politicians aware that look, what you're doing is no longer acceptable. Uh, don't get me wrong; they still don't have the power to change, these politicians and their policies, but they have a handle. They can cry and shout about it. And I think this change has come from the liberalization that happened in the 1990s, 1991, because before that, the state was looking back over its shoulder, looking at its citizens and disappointed with it because everything was my bap. Everything was controlled by the state. It was a nanny state, or you can call it the my bap or fatherly. So a fatherly figure always looks back and says, oh, you're wrong, you are wrong. I did this to you. I'm giving you money. You do this, you do this. But after that, when little bit of power came into the hands, entrepreneurial power, I'm not saying political power, but, power changed things, change India, came into the hands of the people who had the merit to change India. The change that happened in the last 30 years is that now those people are looking back upon, the state. It's reversed. So now they are disappointed with the state. And I think this will grow. Of course, there are so many baggage. I mean, these farm laws and the government willing to stay them is one. When you have all political parties, writing these farm bills and farm reforms in their manifestos, but the moment they come into opposition and they say that, look, we don't want these reforms, obviously there is hypocrisy. And if the government cannot carry them forward, it's a huge disappointment for the younger generation, because what they want is much less of state interference. And because the proof is right there before us, it's like communism. If somebody brings me onto a panel, oh, let's debate the pros and cons of communism, I'll say, go to hell. I mean, aren't you been reading for the last 100 years? Pad kya rahe ho bhai? These debates shouldn't be happening right now. We should not be debating about the ideology or the virulent ideology that is communism now. These debates happened in the 50s and 60s. Khatam karo abhi. So like that, why do I say this? I don't say this because I'm like, as kind of as a very snooty person that, I'm in a huff and puff that, no, I don't want to debate. The point is the proof has come. The proof has come that, this is not a worthwhile thing for people to imbibe. Likewise, the proof has come that the only zone, if I can call it that, in this time period of after our independence, that we did well was after 1990. Now, when you have that proof, when the state relaxed, when the state unshackled its populace, look what they did. And we're talking today, Roshan, when Sensex has touched 50,000, right? In 1990, it was possibly 1,000, right? 50 times more, 50,000 times. So you can imagine, 50 times. The idea is that the people are disappointed with the state. Earlier, the state used to be disappointed with the people. And I just feel that the change is coming, but it's very slowly, very, very slow, because there's so much of baggage. People who really hold the power, they are corrupt people. They don't want to let go of it. They are hypocrites. They don't care a toss about the younger generation. When 65% of India is, less than 30 years old, they don't give a toss. They're still living in that social, the so-called socialism and those visions on those post-Soviet posters in that era. So I'm optimistic, but I'm guarded. The glass is always half full for me, but the frustration is that why the hell is it only half full?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. On that note, we'll have to end the podcast. There were so many things that, I wanted to get to, but unfortunately we couldn't due to the time limits. Thank you so much, Anand. This was a fascinating conversation. And I hope that you continue to have these spirited conversations on as many platforms as possible and continue inspiring all of us to be a little more political and take, heed of the nation's progress and so on. Thank you for tuning in. This podcast was brought to you by the team at Bharat Varta. If you liked this podcast, then don't forget to share, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite platforms. We're available on Anchor, Apple, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, Breaker, YouTube, and a host of other platforms. We started Bharat Varta to facilitate long-form discussions on politics, policy, and culture. We don't necessarily endorse anything that was said in this episode. If you do wish to offer us any feedback on the content or anything else, do reach out to us on social media or get in touch with us on our website, www.bharatvarta.in. The links are in the description below. Thanks again for tuning in. Until next time, stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind.